Okay, today we're going to talk about the rise of the so-called New Left throughout Latin America, which will largely be based in resistance to a lot of neoliberal economic theories that we've talked about before, and also a new wave of Latin American leaders that want to resist U.S. dominance. And we see a large list of different countries we'll talk about today, how the resistance idea continued to develop in the early 2000s and in some countries go all the way up to the present today. And we'll end today with talking about some countries that kept with the neoliberal economic policies and close relationships with the United States. So we're going to define kind of both halves, this kind of split in popular and political opinion in different countries. That seems to be where Latin America still is very largely today. So we'll start off with Venezuela. Last time we talked about Venezuela, we ended with Hugo Chavez becoming president in 1999. He's inaugurated in 99, elected in 98. And once he goes into office in 99, he immediately called for a constitutional convention to rewrite the national constitution. So the constitution's majority, the convention's majority that will rewrite the Constitution, is very supportive of Chavez and a lot of his demands, but there's also quite a lot of sitting legislators and some people in the convention that are very resistant to a lot of changes he wanted to make. So it's a very contentious, controversial thing, and eventually the pro-Chavez majority in the convention disbanded Congress. So they closed Congress and declare themselves, the group that's supposed to write the Constitution, to be the official lawmakers of the country. So that's a very dramatic, big step. Also dismantled the Supreme Court and continued writing the new Constitution, which is finished in the year 2000. So under the new Constitution, the newly rebuilt government will have only one legislative house, so only one group of lawmakers. And critics said that they got rid of the other legislative house because the pro-Chavez party was not able to gain a majority in it in the previous elections. So these are very dramatic steps that seem to be predicated on guaranteeing that that Chavez's party would be able to get enough votes to pass whatever laws it wants. The new constitution gave the presidency more powers and allowed presidents to run for re-election. And under this new constitution, they have to have new national elections. So Chavez ran for president in the 2000 presidential election, the first one under this new constitution, and won that election with about 60% of the popular vote. So he's gaining a lot of political power as this new constitution is going through, and he gets reelected, or elected for the first time under the new constitution. His big economic problem, though, is that oil prices start dropping in 1999, his first year in office. And Chavez is very angry about a lot of these things. And he specifically targets the state-run oil company, the PDVSA, as a basic political target. He said that their mismanagement of the giant state-run company was one of the big economic problems in the country. So he said that the management were either naive or they're corrupt or they're part of some kind of global conspiracy to keep Latin American workers down. But he also pointed out that the general workers in the company were very well paid, and because they were unionized. So Chavez picks out the PDVSA as a kind of target for massive changes that he wants to make to it. He tried to take over the company's board, the board of governors, basically in 2002, which provoked a strike of the company's workers, starts layoffs of many of the workers who went on strike. So both sides in this conflict start holding large marches and protests in spring 2002. The company's side, the anti-Chavez people, basically make a public call for Chavez to resign because he has, they say, caused such damage to the country and he's moving the country in an authoritarian direction. He responded to those criticisms by shutting down private TV stations, shutting down other media outlets who criticized him and his party, and he called the demonstrators that were out in the streets subversives and traitors to the nation and things like that. And he also accused a lot of the people out in the streets of being paid by the United States to go out and cause havoc basically and create this fake movement against him that could try to topple him from power. So many demonstrators started to gather outside the presidential palace in April, and that was very embarrassing to him, just like any major politician, to have protesters right outside their official residence chanting for his resignation. So he ordered the guards of the palace to open fire on the protesters. And so that kills several protesters and wounds many others. And at that point, the military arrests him on murder charges. So he is sent to jail for a while, and the military appointed an interim president who ended the new constitution and reverted back to the old constitution, dissolved the current legislature. And at this point, a lot of people in Venezuela fear that this is going toward a military dictatorship. So Chavez from jail called this, sent out public messages calling this a U.S.-backed coup against the Venezuelan democracy, and called on the Venezuelan people to flood the streets over the next few days and demand his release and his return to power as the democratically elected president. And there's estimates that hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans pour into the streets and demand that he be released and returned to power as the legitimate president. And at this point, the military turns against the president that they just had appointed to be the interim, then put in instead Chavez's vice president in as the interim president. And the vice president then released Chavez and returned him to power just a few days later on April 14th. So Chavez celebrates this, and there's lots of pictures of him out in the crowds like this, celebrating that he says the coup has been defeated and democracy has returned to Venezuela. Chavez still has a large part of the Venezuelan population that's very opposed to him, and many of his opponents called for a general strike in late 2002 to basically try to destroy the Venezuelan economy and force him to resign. And a lot of this resistance came from the oil company itself, the PDVSA. So when they start going on strike, and many other Venezuelans follow this, not a majority of the country by any means, but enough to do a lot of economic damage. So unemployment quickly rises to about 20% by the end of 2002, and inflation starts to grow even up to about 30% per year. So the strike is doing a lot of economic damage, but doesn't seem enough to push him out of office. His response is to go after the oil workers who were leading the strike movement. So he laid off somewhere around 17,000 oil company workers. He replaced the PDVSA's entire governing board and put in his own loyalists to run the company, so that he had a lot of personal control over the company. And with that control, he would generally start to run Venezuelan oil policy much more closely. But the economy continues to be hurt into 2003, so it continues to fall by about 13%, which is a massive amount of economic damage. So after the end of 2002, he starts speaking out very publicly against the United States and accusing the United States of trying to dominate all of Latin America, and he'll start to take several major policy stances in opposition to the United States. One of the big ones is that he argues against U.S. plans for a free trade agreement for all the Americas. He says that Latin American countries should not unite their economies in a giant free trade zone to eliminate all tariffs with the United States, but instead that they should do that for themselves in opposition to the United States. So the big trade agreement that he proposed was basically the Bolivarian alternative for the Americas, and he'll try to sign up other Latin American countries to join Venezuela in this attempt. So it would largely be like an attempt to unite their economies, much like the European Union. He will also promote a new Latin American general bank to replace the World Bank and the IMF, because a lot of Latin American leaders and populations don't trust the IMF and the World Bank. He and many other Latin American leaders had accused the IMF and the World Bank of taking advantage of Latin America and setting them up with massive amounts of debt that they could never pay off in order to gain control over those nations and their resources. So he proposed instead the Banco del Sur, which is basically the Bank of the South, as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF. So if Latin American countries need bailout loans or something like that, if they have another debt crisis, they could go to this bank that they mostly control, that their governments contribute to, in order to get those funds on a much more kind of equal basis without being taken advantage of. And the bank's funds are largely seeded by Venezuelan oil money, especially when oil prices start to rise fairly dramatically after 2003, which we'll see in a few minutes. Chavez is also interested in what we've talked about before, the so-called non-aligned movement, which we've mostly talked about in relation to the Cold War, which ended in around 1989 to 1991 or so, in those years. So the Cold War is not really so much a problem anymore, but the United States is still trying to influence Latin American countries and control them as much as possible. So Chavez talks about the non-aligned movement not so much in Cold War definitions, but as a movement to break Latin American countries away from U.S. dominance. So he will open relations and discussions and have foreign trade deals with other countries that are often defined as U.S. enemies, like Russia or China and Cuba and a lot of other areas. So he's looking to build up an anti-U.S. worldwide kind of alliance. He also tries to make Venezuela into one of the big leaders of OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. OPEC had fallen in power since the early 1980s. OPEC's oil embargoes were very successful in the 1970s and early 80s in pushing oil prices and gasoline prices further and further up so that those countries could gain more revenue for themselves for their product. But by the mid-90s, gas prices and oil prices have gone way, way down. And Chavez was very worried about that, obviously, because oil is one of Venezuela's giant exports. It makes a whole lot of money for Venezuela directly to its government in most instances. And many of the other OPEC countries are in the same position. So Chavez wants to kind of reinvigorate OPEC and push them to do more production cuts and embargoes and things like that to try to push the price of oil and gasoline higher and higher again, because that will make them more money. Chavez will also generally support other leftist politicians that start to rise throughout Latin America that we'll talk about for much of the rest of today. He opens relations with Cuba and even forms a formal alliance with Cuba. He'll support other left-wing politicians in Bolivia, Argentina, many other places throughout Latin America, and talks about building up a general Latin American political movement to resist U.S. dominance. He doesn't have a whole lot of very clear policy goals that he wants to agree on with a lot of those Latin American countries outside of kicking out American dominance. So he generally talks about all you have to do in your country is to build up like a grassroots movement, talk to your poor people, gain their support, possibly expand voting rights in your country so that poor landless people can vote, and connect those poor peasants who work in farms to industrial workers who work in the factories that exist in Latin America, and try to connect them also to the middle class of doctors and lawyers and teachers in your country. And at that point, you have a clear majority of voters, and you can win elections fairly easily. So he is up for re-election in 2006, and he's re-elected very easily with even a higher percentage of the vote than he had in 2000. So he got 63% of the vote in the 2006 elections, and if you divide up the source of his voters, the poor and working class overwhelmingly supported him, And he got a lot of middle class support. Again, the doctors and lawyers and teachers and office workers, people like that. So he still gained a lot of their support, but his support rate amongst the middle class seemed to be falling fairly consistently year after year, largely because they feared that he's eventually going to take a step to build military dictatorship under himself for Venezuela. And of course, the upper class overwhelmingly voted against him because they don't like what he's doing. He's talking about nationalizing companies and redistributing land and all kinds of things. And another big reason that he was reelected so easily is that the economy starts booming after 2003, after those strikes had done so much damage. The Venezuelan economy here in the blue line in this picture just takes off, skyrockets from 2003, 2004. We were talking about 15-20% economic growth. And the government, with all this extra revenue and a booming economy, starts investing a lot of that money into social programs, especially for the poor. So a lot of social spending that cuts the poverty rate in Venezuela virtually in half. The poverty rate was nearing 45% in Venezuela when Chavez came into office, and by 2007, the poverty rate is down to about 25-26%. So that's an extremely impressive number, a lot of progress for poor people, and that's why they vote for him overwhelmingly, because they see the real gains in their lives and their communities. And economic growth will continue to be very solid in Venezuela, at least around 5% and up, until the 2008 financial crash that takes down basically the whole world economy in 2008-2009. And you can see that reflected in the other Latin American countries' economies go down also. So in late 2008 and 2009, just like the rest of the world, there's a whole lot of layoffs going on in Venezuela, and its economy shrinks, goes negative to about 3% or so in 2009. And going into 2012, Chavez is up for re-election again. And because the Venezuelan economy is doing much better by 2012 than virtually any other economy in the world, Chavez was easily reelected. He got 54% of the vote at this point, even though he was clearly dying of cancer during the election, and he traveled to Cuba for treatment in the middle of the campaign, and you could see that he was losing weight and he was not in good health. And he actually died before he could be reinaugurated in March 2013. So the fact that the elected president died before the inauguration under the Constitution triggered another national election between his hand-picked successor named Nicolas Maduro and the same opposition party candidate that Chavez had defeated in 2012. So that was a very close election in 2013 between Maduro and the opposition, and Maduro just barely won a majority, 50.6%. So just a slight bit over half of the votes. So Maduro will be inaugurated in 2013, and Maduro starts on a path of suppressing virtually anyone who criticizes him. He starts off very quickly by blaming all of Venezuela's economic problems on the United States, what he calls U.S. economic warfare against Venezuela. There's a fairly good amount of evidence to prove a lot of that stuff. The U.S. had put in place economic sanctions against Venezuela and whatnot. So Maduro, like Chavez before, had often said this, the United States is trying to destroy the Venezuelan economy, to destroy the Chavez movement, and that virtually all problems in Venezuelan society, crime, corruption, inflation, scarcity of goods on the shelves, that's all attributable to the United States and its attempt to really overthrow the Venezuelan government. And Maduro is not very tolerant of those complaints. So he suppresses demonstrations, he arrests opposition leaders, and international human rights groups define this as Maduro's government kind of sliding toward more and more authoritarianism and looks increasingly likely to build some type of dictatorship to outright control the country. And there are midterm elections in December 2015 to elect lawmakers, and the opposition parties won those elections very easily. So they took control over national legislature in 2016, and they tried a recall effort against Maduro to recall him from office and have a new presidential election. They basically accused him of corruption and suppressing the democracy and whatnot. Maduro used his administrative powers to slow down the investigations and eventually stop that recall movement against him in the legislature, which led to massive protest in the streets against Maduro in late 2016. And those protests brought a heavy government response. It appears that the military went out and fired live ammunition against the protesters, and that's documented by several international human rights groups. So going into 2017, there's basically political chaos. The Supreme Court tried to take over the legislature, and both of the major political parties, Maduro's and the opposition, both also tried to take over the legislature in 2017. And the economy basically collapsed because it seems like no one's in charge and no one can pass any laws during the year. So there's massive shortages of food, medicine, and just basic things that you would find at grocery stores. Millions of Venezuelans emigrate. They leave the country and often go over the border into Colombia or even Brazil to escape the rise of what they are defining as a dictatorship. And in January 2017, Donald Trump becomes U.S. president. He's inaugurated after winning the election in 2016, and his administration takes a completely anti-Maduro stance, condemns basically the entire Maduro party and therefore the entire Venezuelan government. So the United States under Trump starts implementing massive economic sanctions that seem completely aimed at crippling the country as much as possible. Maduro is up for re-election in 2018, and he is actually re-elected in 2018. But many international observers argue that Maduro had forced all government employees to attend his rallies and then eventually vote for him, and that the party was basically watching to make sure that they voted for him. So anyone who's a government employee in Venezuela, which is a largely socialist country, so there's a whole lot of the workforce are government employees, beyond just teachers and government lawyers and bureaucrats and tax collectors and bridge builders and all those types of things, but oil company workers, a lot of other sectors of the economy have been nationalized. So the amount of people who work for the government is a huge proportion of the population. And Maduro reportedly used that and pressured them to vote for him, and if they didn't vote for him or show up to his rallies, they could be fired. So many people accuse it of being a fraudulent election that Maduro ran in order to guarantee his re-election. And after that election, going into January 2019, the National Assembly leader named Juan Guaido came out publicly and started attending mass rallies in January 2019, arguing that because of that fraudulent vote the year before, basically the presidency is vacant. And under the Constitution, if the presidency becomes vacant, then the National Assembly leader should rise as the interim president and run new national elections. So Juan Guaido started making those announcements in January 2019, immediately gets full-scale support from the U.S. government because the U.S. government wants to get rid of Maduro and put someone else probably that the U.S. trusts to run the country and will be much more open to U.S. demands for Venezuela. So that's still about where we're at now. Maduro is still president of the country. Guaido is still kind of traveling the world, trying to build up some type of opposition movement and raise money for that movement inside Venezuela. And the next country on our list is Brazil. And Brazil's big problem in the late 90s becomes economic again. There's another kind of financial crisis that largely starts in Japan and China in 1998, around August 98. So the sitting president won re-election that year in 1998 and has to figure out what he's going to do about this big economic problem that's starting to hit Brazil. So he basically goes to the IMF and he asks for emergency loans. President Cardoso's big goal for the rest of his term in office through 2003 is to just try to avoid a full-scale economic disaster for Brazil. So many historians say that Cardoso's biggest accomplishments might be to have kept Brazil from a full-scale economic collapse, while also following the general election laws, stabilizing the democracy and allowing elections to continue, and eventually he'll term out in 2003 and will be replaced. So another election will be held in 2002, and that largely turns out to be kind of a three-way race that a guy named Lula da Silva won, so he'll be inaugurated in 2003. Da Silva had run on leftist party political platforms since the 1980s. He was one of the big union leaders that led general strikes and whatnot to try to force the military dictatorship out of office since the late 70s. So he was a national figure since the late 70s, so going on, 25 years by this point. He argues for a whole lot of leftist kind of economics, getting rid of neoliberalism and whatnot ever since the early 80s. So when he was elected in 2002, a lot of world observers are really expecting him to go with the far leftist, anti-neoliberal economic policy. And they're very surprised when he actually adopts a fairly moderate economic policy and appoints fairly mainstream economists to be like finance minister and leader of the central bank and whatnot. One of his big policies is to actually pay off the IMF loans in the next few years. And he actually accomplished that by 2005. So that was several years ahead of the payment schedule. So Lula da Silva is very worried about the foreign debt that the Brazilian nation owes, and he moves to eliminate it as best and quickly as he possibly can. Starting in 2003, Brazil starts economic growth on a massive level, largely because he starts signing deals to sell massive amounts of food to China, and also sugar to China, which is still a major Brazilian export, and ethanol, which is a kind of vegetable-based type fuel to China, because China is going through a very rapid industrialization, and it needs raw materials to fuel it, and they buy a whole lot of it from Brazil. And Da Silva will reinvest a lot of that growing money, the tax revenue, into Brazilian industrialization, and trying to get a lot of balanced economic growth in many different sectors. And it's extremely successful. Brazil will grow to be the world's 8th largest economy by about 2006 or so. Da Silva wants to use a lot of that increasing prosperity to reinvest, especially in the poor, to try to bring them out of poverty as much as possible and give them a better chance in life. One of his big policies that has been around before him, but he really ramps up quite a lot, is called the Bolsa Familia, which is really the family grant, where the Brazilian government gave the poorest of the poor $35 per month, so that the extreme poor can afford to keep their children in school, and can allow their family to continue getting medical checkups and have some amount of healthcare access. He expands the public education system, especially with tuition-free universities. And that combination really builds up his political support base amongst the poor and also the middle classes. The middle class, just like the United States, often cannot afford to pay high tuition rates to send their children to universities. So they're very supportive of these tuition-free universities, that if you have the grades and you get in, you basically go there for free. His economic management is so successful that he still very easily wins re-election in the 2006 elections. So he gets about 60%, 61% of the runoff vote, and his party largely follows him in these electoral victories. So his party often has a huge amount of votes in the legislature and can pass virtually any law that they really focus on and want. De Silva also joins this worldwide and especially Latin American-wide effort to oppose U.S. dominance over the region. He does a lot of things, especially in economics, to try to attack U.S. dominance over especially certain markets like cotton. So De Silva pushed Brazil to basically file a lawsuit at the worldwide kind of trading courtroom called the World Trade Organization, and as a lawsuit that accused the United States of illegally subsidizing its own cotton farmers in the United States. And that was a big worldwide story because someone actually had the guts to make that attempt. De Silva also tried to push Brazil to the forefront of world politics and get more of a voice on the world stage. He sent Brazilian forces to assist UN peacekeepers in Haiti. He will try to get Brazil a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, which is a giant change because a permanent seat means that not only is your country always at the table to negotiate, but your country has veto power over UN security resolutions. And that is a big deal. Only 5 countries have that veto power still today. The United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China. So for Brazil to get that kind of a seat would be a major statement to the world that Brazil is on par with the major powerful countries that won World War II and have really retained that power for themselves in the UN ever since 1945. So De Silva starts making that argument and going to the rest of the world, trying to get enough votes in the UN to get that permanent seat. It doesn't happen, but he continues making the argument and opens up the worldwide debate, really, about those 5 countries that have the permanent veto power. Maybe the world has changed a little bit since 1945, and the rest of the UN should consider some kind of reform. So De Silva basically terms out, can only serve 2 straight terms as president. So there will be new elections in 2010. Lula basically chooses his hand-picked successor, who had been, I think it was Minister of Energy under him, named Dilma Rousseff, picks her to, and supports her to run for the nomination from his party for the presidency. And she won 56% of the runoff vote in 2010, largely based on Lula's massive popularity throughout the entire country. So she'll be inaugurated in 2011. And she'll continue most of his big economic projects on infrastructure, industrialization, poor relief, some land redistribution. So going into the 2014 elections, Rousseff barely won re-election, even in the runoff round, largely based on this lot of public anger against the government spending programs and seen as kind of wasteful spending and raising the public transport fees. But there's also an investigation into Petrobras, which is the national statewide, state-owned oil company. So there's investigations into corruption within the oil company, which eventually reached up to several of her political party's kind of high-level officials. And historians are still arguing about this, but there's a lot of suspicion that those lower-level politicians, instead of taking the blame for a lot of this corruption, kind of pointed the finger upward, so that these accusations go to higher and higher levels in the party and eventually get to her personally. And there's even some tape recordings that have been released of individual politicians saying in private, without knowing they're being recorded, that they only moved to impeach her and remove her from office in order to distract the population and kind of throw all the spotlight toward her so that they could escape being investigated themselves. Rousseff is eventually impeached and removed from office, which makes her vice president, Temer, the new president. His popularity absolutely plummets because of these ongoing corruption investigations, and that eventually target him as well, with a pretty good amount of clarity that he had been taking bribes as a lifetime politician for many years. But even though his popularity plummets, I mean, all the way down to something like 2% a year later, only 2% of the population say they approve of the job he's doing. even though he is very unpopular, he is still the sitting president, and he directs his political appointees to start bringing charges against Lula da Silva, basically money laundering and bribery and corruption charges, and they get him convicted of those charges and sentence him to over 9 years in jail. And many people in Brazil see that as Temer's attempt to get Lula in jail so that he can't run for president in the national elections in 2018. So Da Silva's party, even though he's sitting in jail, still nominated him for president anyway in 2018. But because the Workers' Party, Da Silva's party, was so largely humiliated because of these investigations and him being thrown in jail, they don't have much of a chance at winning the presidency in the 2018 elections. So the more likely outcome is that a far-right politician from another political party is leading in the polls in 2018 and eventually does win the 2018 presidential election. And his name is Jair Bolsonaro. And Bolsonaro has been around in Brazilian politics for 20, 30 years by that point. So his policy stances are pretty long-standing. He hasn't won a lot of elections because his policy ideas are so far to the right of the general Brazilian population. But his party was the most organized going into the 2018 elections, so he won those elections and would be inaugurated in 2019 and would start putting his ideas into government policy. So he is really based on denying climate change, allowing oil drilling and kind of environmental exploitation to just run rampant because he doesn't think that it's doing any damage really at all and is getting a lot of economic growth. So he has a lot of statements about indigenous Brazilian people being not fully evolved, and you can kind of push them out of the way if they're occupying certain land that you want to develop for industrialization or starting European-style farms or something like that. So he takes a very generally racist stance against Native Americans, especially in Brazil. The combination of his anti-indigenous stance and his anti-climate change stance tend to result in a lot of destruction in the Amazon rainforest. He gives the green light to basically a lot of what we call agribusiness, kind of industrial farms, to go into the edges of the Amazon and just start cutting it down month after month, to basically get rid of all those trees and all that vegetation so that they can plant whatever they want to farm, sugar or soybeans or palm oil or whatever they're after. So the whole world has been watching this since 2019 with great fear, because the more of the rainforest that you destroy, that means it will be able to mitigate climate change much less and produce less clean oxygen. So many people around the world are seeing what Bolsonaro is doing as being a threat to human civilization for the long-term future. His economic policies are generally neoliberalism, total free market ideology. He wants to get rid of tariffs. He wants to eliminate taxes as much as possible on rich people. He wants to eliminate tuition-free universities. He wants to do quite a lot of free market neoliberal type things. So he starts putting those into effect when he enters office in 2019. And so far, the unemployment rate has stayed about the same since he's gone into office, even though he promised that his neoliberal policies would reduce unemployment. So unemployment is still over 10%, often closer to 15%. And inflation is fairly low. It's somewhere around between 2 to 4%, which is a little bit higher than most economists really want, but it's not seen as catastrophic. And when the global COVID-19 pandemic started in early 2020, he was one of the major worldwide politicians that denied it as a health threat and refused to wear a face mask and all this, even after he caught it himself in July 2020. So we'll see where that leads Brazil into the future. And the next country on our list is Argentina. So Argentina, since 1999, has experienced a lot of, especially in the early 2000s, a lot of economic problems. There were massive public runs on banks in 1999 going into 2000, basically as a lot of individual people in Argentina worried that their bank was going to go bankrupt and take all of their life savings with it. So when that rumor spreads, a lot of people leave their job or their whatever they're doing that day and they run to their bank. That's why it's called a bank run. And they just try to take out all their money from the bank in order to save their life savings. So they try to walk out with as much cash out of their accounts as they can get before the bank goes bankrupt and they lose everything. But of course, the first people there can get their money out quick. But the bank runs out of cash to give out. The ATMs run dry, basically, and that just forces the bank into an even earlier bankruptcy that affects more people. So the psychology of panic really hits the Argentine population and contributes to an ongoing financial crisis that starts in '99 and goes for a couple years. The Argentine government went and asked the IMF for assistance for a major bailout. And the IMF came back with its offer, which included a lot of austerity and whatnot that the government did not want to do. And in this instance, there is no deal. So the IMF refused, and the Argentine government refused to come to an agreement, which led Argentina to completely default on all its foreign debts, which caused major economic problems. The government had to freeze all dollars in bank accounts throughout the entire country so that they could not be withdrawn in order to stop dollars from leaving the country immediately, which could tank their entire economy. Unemployment grows to 20% by 2001, so there's rioting, there's looting in big cities, as we see in the picture here, as people are angry and feeling desperate. And the U.S. government said that this is what Argentina gets because they had given too much money to like public pensions and all kinds of things. And the U.S. government basically accuses of Argentina of running its economy so badly for several decades that this is what this all led to. So there's going to be national elections in 2003, and the president who eventually won was named Nestor Kirchner. He was from the Peronist party, so Juan Perón's kind of the holdover of his own party. So he won the 2003 elections, mostly on the promise of getting rid of a lot of the amnesty laws that had allowed the military dictatorship from previous years, the people had kind of committed crimes, to really get away with it. So that was his really big campaign promise in 2003, and that was the one that won. But as he entered office, his bigger focus is much more largely economic. So when he got into office, the economy is starting to recover by itself, largely from an agricultural boom, where Argentina is now selling huge amounts of its cash crops to China to fuel China's industrialization and its growing population. So that tends to gain so much money for Argentina as revenue that Kirchner decides to pay off the IMF loans, the ones that were still outstanding, to try to eliminate this foreign debt crisis. But notably, Kirchner agreed to pay off the IMF loans, but refused to pay off private loans that had been created for individual businesses and sometimes even to the Argentine government that had gone to default. A lot of private companies started buying up those loans for pennies on the dollar, basically betting that at some point they can force Argentina to repay those loans in full. And Kirchner knew what was happening here, and he notably refused to pay off those loans that had gone to basically private collection agencies, very large collection agencies that have offices in Wall Street and whatnot. And he basically accused those companies of saying, well, you took the risk of buying these loans in the first place, so that's your problem. Kirchner will also renationalize several of the industries that have been privatized under his predecessors. So he thinks that that is a good policy to get economic growth going again and stabilize the economy. He also pushed for closer relationships amongst the Latin American countries and especially tried to convince them to join Mercosur, which is here in the map. The original founding countries are in blue, which is basically a South American type of free trade agreement. So Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay had started Mercosur as an attempt to unite their economies, get rid of the cross-border tariffs, and a lot of the countries in yellow, Bolivia, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, are very interested in at some point joining this. So Kirchner talks it up and tries to get those countries to join in order to make a lot of South America into a large unified economy, much like the European Union. And if that's successful, that could be a world-changing type scenario. Kirchner decided not to run for re-election in 2007 when his term was up, because we now know he was having medical problems and would actually die just a little bit after those elections. So he nominated and convinced his political party to support his wife, who was a sitting senator at the time. So Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner is nominated by the party and wins the 2007 presidential elections. So she's the leader of this kind of neo-Peronist party, and she runs for office based on a lot of old Peronist ideas of state intervention in the economy. And the economy is doing very well by 2007, 2008. So she rides a wave of kind of popularity because of the growing economy. The agricultural boom, again, is the biggest economic driver of the growing economy, especially Argentina's close economic relationships with East Asia and especially China. But late in 2008, that's when the worldwide financial crisis starts in New York City and then has the ripple effect throughout the globe. So that starts a worldwide recession that goes through the end of 2009, and that sank her popularity quite a bit. Because there's a lot of layoffs and unemployment is rising, and there's a rise in poverty and whatnot. So she tried to recover her popularity by reviving a lot of social programs like Social Security. She wanted to raise tax revenue by increasing export taxes to help pay for the increasing government programs and the poverty alleviation because poverty is growing. Both of those tend to anger a lot of especially economic elites, wealthy people in Argentina, because they run the companies that are doing the exporting, so they're going to have to pay higher taxes. So she ran for re-election in 2011 and got 54% of the vote. After the election, she starts going after a lot of the kind of people in the media, like newspaper reporters and political pundits on TV that have been attacking her pretty mercilessly for the past couple of years. So she kind of criticizes them and says that Argentina's one of its big political problems is that its media has been monopolized. So she starts pushing laws to break up these large, vast media empires that will force those companies to be broken up into smaller pieces, because she said it's not good for democracy to have a lot of the public debate run by monopolistic companies. And of course those companies hate what she's doing, and so they launch a major kind of public relations counterattack against her. So her popularity continues to go down and down and down, but she is going to term out in 2015. And the former mayor of Buenos Aires, the giant city in Argentina, Macri, he ran for president as an opponent to the Peronist party. So he's much more of a conservative. So once he goes into office in 2015, he starts implementing major neoliberal policies. He gets rid of government controls over the currency. He gets rid of government rules that had prevented Argentines from buying and selling a lot of foreign currency, so a lot of foreign currencies start moving through Argentina at much higher rates. He eliminated those export taxes as much as he possibly could, not totally, but he cut them to a very great degree, especially on agriculture, because the agricultural businesses were some of his main backers in the election. and he finally ended this long-term controversy that had started under Nestor Kirchner to finally pay out those Wall Street firms that had bought up large pieces of the Argentine national debt for pennies on the dollar. So that was a long-term kind of standoff between the Kirchners and those international banks. Macri signs off on a final deal to pay off those debt holders at 75% of the face value of the debts that they had bought. So they're still going to make money, and quite a lot of money, off of this deal, but not nearly as much as they would have made if they had gotten the full repayment. Macri is also fairly conservative, so he moves Argentine foreign policy away from its friendly relationship with the more leftist countries like Venezuela and the others that are rising the new left that we're talking about today in the early 2000s. And Macri will push Argentina much closer to a friendly relationship with the United States and the European Union. And once the Panama Papers come out, which is a worldwide revelation of wealthy entities and politicians who have been hiding money from taxation in these little kind of companies that were based in these tiny islands in the Caribbean. When he is named personally as one of the investors in those companies, basically hiding millions and millions of dollars of his own family's wealth to keep it away from Argentine taxation. When that is revealed, his attempt at getting reelected in 2019 will fail because much of the population accuses him of being extremely corrupt and, lying through his teeth to the Argentine voters. The Argentine economy under him is doing fairly bad. There's 50% inflation by 2019 when he's up for re-election. Poverty has risen to 35%, and he is actively trying to pursue more IMF bailout loans. So there's a lot of kind of questionable economic results, and the population decided to vote against him in his re-election attempt, and they put back in the Peronist Party nominees. So that's where they still are now. And the next country on our list is Bolivia. So Bolivia has an interesting evolution politically since the early 2000s. We've talked about Bolivia's attempt to privatize the water supply of the main city, Cochabamba. And that law went through, and private company that bought the water supply tripled the water fees for the residents of the city virtually overnight. So that started off a major protest movement and a lot of demonstrations. And at the same time, in 2003, there's also a lot of laws that the conservative government is pushing through. Were often seen as an attack on cocoa workers, which are some of the poorest people in Bolivia. So this kind of combined rise of these two different protest movements unite in 2003 to shut down a lot of the nation and do a lot of economic damage. So especially the Cocoa Growers Union starts lining up on roads and filling the roads to the point where cars can't get through and trucks can't get through. So commerce really grinds down to a halt, and the government sent in troops to force the roads to be reopened in October, and those troops actually fire live ammunition and kill lots of these striking union workers right there in the streets. There's so much popular anger against the president for having done this. They forced him to resign, and new elections were called for 2005. And the Cocoa Growers Union leader, who led a lot of this mass protest and these resistance movements, ran for the presidency of the country in 2005 and won. So he'll be inaugurated after getting 54% of the vote. And his name is Evo Morales. And he's very interesting because he comes from an indigenous background. So he will be one of the first Latin American politicians to be elected president of any Latin American country that comes directly and identifies with an indigenous background and identifies with a poverty background. So this is often seen throughout the world as the Bolivian poor people voting for one of their own members to take up national leadership and make big changes. And he does make big changes right after his inauguration. He quickly nationalized oil production throughout the country and negotiated new contracts with Brazil's state-owned oil company because Brazil is one of its biggest customers. So there are quickly big changes in oil and natural gas production industries, and their efficiency and their profits start to grow very quickly. Morales will also push Bolivia to form closer alliances with Cuba and Venezuela. Morales is very much a socialist. He is very much on the left, and he wants to contribute to the rise of the so-called new leftist movement in the early 2000s throughout Latin America. He also leads a movement to change the Constitution, to amend it in 2009, to declare that all the natural resources in Bolivia were the people's property, and that the government should be charged with administrating that property for the mass benefit of the people. So that Constitution passed by referendum in 2009, and after that he also ran another referendum to pass some laws saying that the government should have power to confiscate and redistribute private land if some private landowner owned over 12,000 acres of land. So 12,000 acres is a massive amount of land, and Morales and his supporters argued that no one person, no one company needs to own more than that to make a whole lot of money and live a nice, rich lifestyle forever. So anyone who owns more than that, the government will confiscate that excess land, start redistributing it, or maybe the government will run it. I mean, it'll become government land, so the government will make decisions about what to do with it. So, of course, the wealthy landed interests and the big agricultural companies rebel against that, and they start trying to build political opposition to Morales, and they even start talking about possible secession movements to take the lands that they own and try to build like a revolutionary movement to build a whole new country around those lands. That one largely fails for the long term and still hasn't happened today. They're so upset with Morales, they tried to get going on a national recall to force him out of office in 2007, so just 2 years after he's started this policy path. They do get a recall on the ballot, and there is a national vote, but 2/3 of the Bolivian voters vote to keep him in office, so he stays. And he is up for another re-election in 2009, which he won overwhelmingly. Over, I think it was 70% or so of the popular vote in the 2009 elections. So he has the mass support of the general population, and especially, obviously, the poor people. After his re-election in 2009, he started other policy ideas that the poor will be very resistant to. Especially, he wants to cut government subsidies for poor people to buy gasoline and diesel fuel. So they're very resistant to that because that's going to, cut into their monthly budget as a family. So they speak out against him for that, and they start resisting that. He also signed off on plans to build a major highway through the Amazon basin, which would go through a lot of old indigenous lands, and so that angered a lot of indigenous groups against him. So they start accusing him of, being on a path of kind of selling out his previous interest and his previous community. To get more support from conservative and wealthy backers who would be the main beneficiaries of such a highway system. So he argues he's just trying to continue industrialization for Bolivia to help all people, but a lot of the poor people have a very different perspective on this stuff. One of the biggest laws that he pushed through was in 2012 called the Law of the Mother Earth, which is a very big change across the whole world. The whole world watches this because this law says that the government must protect natural ecosystems the same as human rights. So this is saying that the government has a responsibility to protect natural environment throughout the entire country, and that responsibility is just as high as protecting the natural human rights of its people. So that is seen across the world as a new kind of legal framework for protecting the environment and making sure that somehow we can slow down at least the climate change problem, which is a big long-term threat to humanity's survival. Morales ran for a third term as president in 2014 and was reelected with about 61% of the vote, so again, a fairly large majority. He ran a referendum in 2016 to ask the Bolivian people if they would allow him to run for a fourth term as president, which is not legal under the Bolivian constitution. But he lost that referendum. The people voted no. So he seems fairly obsessed from about 2016 to the elections in 2019, trying to find a way to stay in office. So he has his lawyers file a lawsuit that goes all the way to the Bolivian Supreme Court to appeal the referendum and try to get some kind of court statement to clarify if he would be able to run for a fourth term. He did win that appeal at the Supreme Court, so he put himself on the ballot for a fourth term in 2019, and he actually won that election too, a smaller majority, but he seems to have gotten a majority of the votes. Bolivian conservatives were very angry at that. They said that this was completely unconstitutional, and convinced even the United States, which the U.S. government tends to be very opposed to Morales because of a lot of his very leftist kind of leanings and his policies. So the U.S. has been looking for an excuse to try to get rid of Morales for quite a few years. By 2019, U.S. media starts to report on vote rigging in the 2019 elections, and that it was completely fraudulent, and that a lot of Bolivian people are taking to the streets to try to force him out of office. There were some protest movements, but they don't seem to be very large. But under massive pressure from especially the U.S. government and conservatives in his own country, Morales did resign in October 2019 and went into exile, eventually landing in Mexico. And because he vacated the presidency, the Constitution said that one of the leaders in Congress would take over as interim president, which they did, and that leader of Congress was very conservative and tries to use their new position as interim president to undo a lot of the laws that Morales had passed. But quickly after that, in early 2020, is when the COVID-19 worldwide pandemic got going. So there's a lot of health problems in Bolivia. The interim president had promised to run new presidential elections at some point in 2020, but as the pandemic was going, kept delaying and delaying those elections month after month because they said the public health threat was just you can't run an election while that's going on. So finally they did hold a nationwide presidential election in 2020 that Morales' party won. So the new president of the country will go in November of 2020 and will invite Morales back into the country as a private citizen, and Morales does return to Bolivia in late 2020 as a resident, not a politician anymore. So we'll see if he tries to run for office in some other position or what's going to happen in the future. The next country on our list is Ecuador. And in Ecuador, political control through elections had really alternated between the far right and the far left from the 80s going into the 1990s, often somewhat chaotically. So the government doesn't have a whole lot of real long-term effective economic policies. And this really continues until a leftist won the 2006 presidential elections, and his name is Rafael Correa. He ran on a platform of really doing much the same that Morales in Bolivia was doing, that Chavez in Venezuela was doing, and even Lula da Silva in Brazil was doing. So Correa runs on this kind of new left type of identity in Latin America, and he wins. So he'll go into office in 2007. And his policies are largely to end neoliberalism and to stand up against U.S. dominance. So the United States in 2007 was trying to negotiate a so-called free trade agreement with Central America and South America, and trying to extend basically NAFTA to all of the Americas. And Correa, when he went into office in 2007, took a hard stance against that and told Latin Americans, advised them that they should not participate in a U.S.-led free trade agreement, that if anything they should create their own to unite their own economies in opposition to the United States. So Correa said that the U.S. free trade agreement that was being negotiated at that point was really an excuse and a tool for for U.S. imperialism to continue to generally dominate Latin America and use that as a resource to dominate the rest of the world. So Correa is an outspoken opponent to U.S. imperialism, specifically in Latin America. And he stopped a deal between Ecuador and the United States that allowed U.S. troops to be stationed in Ecuador on military bases. And he stopped that deal and caused a lot of outrage. I think that was around 2009 or so. A lot of U.S. leaders criticized Correa, saying, well, why do you want our troops to leave your country? And he kind of joked in the worldwide media, saying, well, I'll make you a deal. The U.S. can keep some U.S. troops in Ecuador if Ecuador is allowed to keep Ecuadorian troops in Florida. And, of course, the United States rejected that, and Correa just kind of laughed it off. Correa is really joining with a lot of other leftists throughout Latin America and trying to stand up for sovereignty and whatnot, like Evo Morales and Chavez and whatnot. So this seems to be a kind of rising movement amongst Latin Americans to take an increased stand against the U.S. and long-term U.S. dominance. Correa supported some major changes to the Ecuadorian constitution. The constitution has been amended many times and entirely rewritten many times throughout Ecuadorian history. The biggest changes were to allow for the president to run for re-election, so opens up any presidential candidate to win 2 different terms. And the new constitution is approved in 2008, and that demands that new national elections will be held in 2009. So Correa runs for election for a first term under the new constitution as president in 2009, and he won pretty easily. Ecuador still has large oil reserves and was actively mining them and selling them on the world markets. And especially after about 2003, world oil prices are growing very quickly. So there's a lot of government revenue coming in from selling oil throughout the world to Ecuador. So the Ecuadorian government under Correa starts using that revenue to alleviate poverty, to develop infrastructure, and continue on the industrialization path. Correa refused to pay the national debt and refused to pay even the monthly payments on the national debt because he accused the United States and its companies and other kind of corrupt countries of forcing Ecuador to accept those debts in the first place, largely starting in the 1960s. So he just stops making the payments. Does not have a gigantic economic effect in Ecuador. He went after press coverage that was critical of him, not the repressive ways. He's a media personality in a lot of ways, and he's not hesitant to go to media outlets and give interviews and directly attack certain reporters for what he accuses are like illogical statements or accusing them of being corrupt or something like that, or just trying to criticize him to reduce his popularity, to bring other politicians in who would be much more open to giving the U.S. more control over Ecuador. He did file one major lawsuit against a media company, but that's very different from, say, a military dictatorship going through and closing down newspapers and jailing reporters or something like that. So Correa is up for re-election in 2013 and won re-election fairly easily, and continue using oil revenue to redistribute income, especially to the poor, to alleviate poverty. But Correa is also, he was an economist. He wasn't a lifetime politician before he became president. So he's very wary of running a fairly mixed economy, a balanced economy, because he realizes if you just throw everything toward poverty alleviation, that could cause other imbalances in the economy in other areas. So he also made sure to never really alienate the big businesses and to allow them to continue to grow. So he wants to keep as much kind of moderate support and big business support for his policies as he can. So he's not so much of a leftist as he often advertises himself to be, especially in economic policy. So he serves another term as president after 2013, and after that he terms out. So he's going to leave office, and he nominates his sitting vice president named Lenin Moreno to be the party's nominee in the 2017 elections. So Moreno becomes a nominee and runs his campaign based on the idea of unifying the Latin American economies, He is permanently in a wheelchair, so he talks a lot about rights for disabled people, and also using redistribution of income to eliminate poverty as much as possible. So that's a fairly popular kind of political stance in Ecuador. He and Correa have a falling out, though, over the WikiLeaks guy, Julian Assange. So Assange is given amnesty by Correa. So he basically holds up in the Ecuadorian embassy for years. And Correa allows him to stay because Assange is a big symbol of resistance to U.S. world dominance. And that changes when Moreno goes into office. Assange continues publishing secret government documents, and some that he published directly revealed that Moreno had profited from bribery and money laundering in Ecuador earlier in his political career. So Moreno starts to hate Assange, and Moreno basically kicks Assange out of the embassy, which leads Assange to be arrested. And Assange is still sitting in jail in London, waiting extradition hearings to the United States. So Correa hates that Moreno has done this, and Correa and Moreno have a falling out to the point where Correa calls Moreno the biggest traitor in Ecuador's history, which is a pretty big statement because there's been a lot of other Ecuadorian politicians that have done very questionable things in selling out their own people. And that sends us on to one of the other major leftist countries that have been around in Latin America since the 1950s, and that's Cuba. So Castro's been in office, and his big goals for his first few decades was poverty alleviation, and to do a lot of things to help poor people, like eliminate illiteracy amongst poor people, eliminate hunger, give them better health care, and to try to eliminate racism, at least in government jobs hiring, which is a big thing because it becomes a communist economy. And he's fairly successful at a lot of those things. So Castro stays in power for decades and still is in power when the Soviet Union collapses in 1989 and the early 90s. And that had a dramatic effect on Cuba. The Cuban economy collapses with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was Cuba's biggest trading partner, along with the Eastern European Soviet satellite countries. So when those countries suddenly go into chaos and they stop their economic deals with Cuba in the early 90s, the Cuban economy just is destroyed. So the Cuban economy shrinks by 30%. So a third of the economy just disappears. There's mass layoffs, supplies run out on Cuban shelves, there's a lack of food being imported into the country, so there's all kinds of major economic problems. Until about 1994, you can see on this chart the economy starts to recover. And by 95, they're back into kind of growth mode again. But the economic hit has been extreme. Some economists argue that what happened in Cuba in the early 90s economically was worse than what happened in any Latin American country during the entire Great Depression. And Castro's response to this was to say, we're going to get back on our feet economically, but the revolution from the 1950s is still legitimate. It accomplished a lot of things. The Cuban people are great. Socialism is the solution, and on and on. His big move, his big change that he's kind of put under pressure to make is to open up popular elections to elect lawmakers. But the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe leads to some fairly unexpected results. By the mid-90s, and even sooner than that, several major countries will open up their relationships with Cuba because now that the Cold War is over, they think, well, we don't have anything to fear by having economic relations with Cuba anymore because there is no Soviet Union. So Canada and Mexico are the first to reopen their economies to Cuba in the early 90s, and then Venezuela does so. And really, one by one, most countries around the world will start opening up to Cuba again and having normal relations and economic deals and whatnot. And that's one of the big reasons that by 1994, the Cuban economic growth goes back up, usually over 5% per year. And if you look at Cuba's economic growth, it's been pretty steady and pretty solid, even after the 2008 worldwide financial crisis. You can see their growth rate goes down to near zero for a little while, but that's much better than other countries like the United States that are just going into economic free fall. So the Cuban economy is still growing even during the global recession of 2008 and 2009. But the United States still demands what it calls regime change For some reason, the United States still looks at Cuba and Castro as a giant threat to the United States, to U.S. survival. So the U.S. formal policy is still to have economic sanctions to try to strangle the Cuban economy, to try to force Castro and the dictatorship out of office. But that's a fairly unpopular idea by the late 90s across the entire world. By the early 2000s, the United Nations will hold a general vote every single year about whether the United States should end its economic embargo of Cuba. And every single year the vote happens, and it's basically the whole world votes yes, the United States should end that, and there's only two countries that vote no, and that's the United States and Israel. Castro's getting older by the late 90s, early 2000s. He had an important surgery in 2006 that incapacitated him to the point where he basically has to retire. So Fidel passed the presidency on to his younger brother Raul in 2006, who was immediately elected the formal president of Cuba. And the biggest change that we see in Cuba in the 2000s is when in 2014 the Obama administration in the United States decided that keeping these economic sanctions on Cuba were pretty meaningless and useless to this point, because the Cold War has been over for going on 25 years. And Obama says basically that all those economic sanctions intended to undo the Cuban government haven't worked for 50 years. So it's time to take them away and try something new. So Obama starts lowering the kind of rhetoric against Cuba and starts eliminating sanctions piece by piece, and even visited Cuba himself in March 2016. So that was seen as a major turning point where the U.S. puts Cuba basically on the road to economic rehabilitation so that Cuba could function like a normal country in relation to the United States. Raul officially retired because he's getting older too in 2018, and that left the sitting vice president to ascend to the presidency, and his name is Miguel Diaz-Canel. And he is a much younger person. He's born in 1960, so he's about 60 years old now. But he is seen as the younger generation of Cuban politicians because he was born after the revolution. Right after this, in 2017, Donald Trump entered the U.S. presidency and immediately reversed all of the Obama administration's kind of opening of relations with Cuba and reimposed sanctions and all that stuff almost immediately when he went into office in January 2017. After Trump lost his re-election attempt in 2020, we'll see if the later administrations will go back to Obama's policy of opening back up to Cuba again. So that does it for all the major kind of leftist countries that have made up the so-called New Left in Latin America. But that's really not all of the New Left countries. We kind of skip past several of the smaller ones. But there are still other countries in Latin America that continue on the neoliberal path and continue on the path of having close relationships with the United States. Probably one of the biggest ones and clearest ones is Mexico. Mexico passed NAFTA, which is a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada, in I think it was 1992-93. So that was still in effect. Mexico is going along with U.S. demands with NAFTA, and Mexico profits pretty well off of NAFTA for quite a while. And the big change in Mexican politics was the election of 2000, which was opened up to candidates outside of the PRI, the major political party that's dominated Mexico since the 1930s. So other parties have a legitimate chance of winning elections in Mexico since 2000. Put a guy named Vicente Fox into office, and he's fairly conservative, and he is a neoliberal, and he started running neoliberal economics in Mexico in the early 2000s. And the president elected after him in 2006, Calderon, started a war against the drug cartels that the U.S. has supported ever since and is still going on. Mexico, though, did oppose the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and did so from an important position as chair of the UN Security Council in early 2003. So Mexico led, in a lot of ways, the worldwide resistance and stopping any UN permission for the United States to invade Iraq in 2003, which angered the United States to no end, but they invaded Iraq anyway. Panama continues its neoliberal policies since the 1990s. Nicaragua actually joined with a free trade agreement with the United States in the early 2000s and started talking about even building a canal that has been talked about in Nicaragua since the mid-1800s. So they were actively negotiating to do that with U.S. companies. But at the same time, the Nicaraguan government is still somewhat socialist, and they still want to keep their high level of support for social services. Chile, under their president, Michelle Bachelet, promised kind of both sides of it. They promised to continue with the social services to alleviate poverty and build up industrialization. But even at the same time, while they continue on a neoliberal path, privatizing the education system, Chile is still on very much a neoliberal path. Colombia has been very much back and forth on neoliberalism, depending on which political party is in office at the time, and its problems seem to be much more heavily related toward narco trafficking and the FARC, a revolutionary movement that has still been fighting up until the 20-teens, and Colombian presidents have been very interested in trying to negotiate a final peace treaty to end the FARC rebellion. Peru has continued its neoliberal policies since the early 2000s, to the point that the main two political parties that continue to win elections in Peru to this day are still kind of right-wing party and then more moderate right-side party. So politics in Peru is very heavily tilted toward neoliberal economics today. So I show you this map on the right as a kind of color-coded map where the new leftist type of countries are in red, or a kind of deeper reddish color. And you can see on the little key on the left side, there's a line down the middle where the more neoliberal-oriented parties are in greenish or kind of tannish colors. So you see there's still an ongoing debate within Latin America all over the place about whether or not the individual country that you're in should follow neoliberalism, or if it should stand up to the United States and possibly build some other kind of economic cooperation groups with just among Latin American countries that would exclude the United States. So those debates continue today, and they're still fairly controversial, and elections are won and lost often based on those debates and the economic results of neoliberal policy. So we'll end the course here, and we'll start moving toward the final exam, but it's interesting to see what kind of path they'll follow in the future.